Most Western Orientalism looked at Byzantine sources, and people forget that the Muslims defeated the Byzantines, so most of those sources were polemical. And so they would attack the Muslims and say horrible things about the Muslims in the same way that we said horrible things about the Huns during World War I when they weren't like the Nazis. And certainly the Iraqis in Kuwait, we know what they said about throwing the babies out of the, and then we found out that was a PR firm that coached that daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to say that it never happened. The Iraqis didn't pull any babies out, but this is polemic. You know, in war, the first casualty is the truth, they say. And so I was struck by how the Syriac, the Christians loved the Muslims because they were liberated under them, because they were oppressed under the Byzantines. And so they were saying how wonderful the Muslims were and how incredible. And also Fred Donner, who is a world-class historian, showed in Muhammad and the Believers that there's no historical evidence that Muslims destroyed any churches in the conquest. He said there's no historical evidence. And one of the things we have in Usul is called Istishab al-Ma'kus, which is a very sophisticated backward approach to a current situation. So traditionally you look at precedent and how it affects the present. So how the past, but there's also a way that jurists in Islam look at the present and how it informs us of the past. The fact that these great churches existed in Iraq for 1400 years and the Christians precede the Muslims in those places is proof that the Muslims always honored those. So the destruction of these churches is completely alien to the Islamic tradition. The Muslims did not forget their religion for 1400 years and then this enlightened group called ISIS suddenly realized here's the true Islam that we're going to implement. It's just complete nonsense. So these great churches that have been destroyed, this is one of the greatest crimes in our history. And unfortunately, they are a sect of people that claim to be Muslims, and it's going to be a blemish on our history, just like the burning of the Church of the Sepulchre was a blemish on the Fatimids when they burnt it down, and 70 years later caused the Crusades. But lest people forget, Muslims immediately rebuilt that church, and recently Sheikh Muhammad paid for the renovation of one of the great churches in Jerusalem. So the Muslims, they honored the Christians. And I have 200 years ago, I have a book by Sawi in Egypt where he says, it's sad to hear so many Muslims saying, I wish I was a Christian, because the perks that the Christians got. The Armenians in Ottoman Turkey were called the al-Fadila. Before the Armenian crises, they were one of the most honored groups in the Ottoman tradition. And the same is true with the Jews. The Shabrut was what we would call a prime minister today under Abdurrahman II. So Christians and Jews and even Buddhists, the Barmekids were from a Buddhist shrine keepers, the great Buddhist traditions of Central Asia. So the Muslims, they had multicultural, multi-ethnic civilizations. This whole idea that we're the first multi-ethnic civilization in history it's just stupidity. It's just a hallmark of our ignorance. And they're undeniably, I would argue that America is probably the most progressive civilization in human history in terms of legislating non-discriminatory law. I think that would be a fair thing to say. But the Muslims, for pre-modern records, nobody compares to the Muslims. And I say that objectively as a student of the history of that civilization. I don't think any society, and Toynbee and others would also, I think, make that point as well. Alhamdulillah,